So, well, let's Stella get settled up, and I just wanted to give a brief introduction to Stella Jacob and her work on mediation in virtual spaces. Mathieu was concluding his presentation with the place of human beings, and we talked a lot about the place of human beings this morning, diversity, of inclusion, of alternative practices, and with Stella. Some of the following presentations, we're going to talk about that again, about human beings, and in particular the creation of safe spaces and how we can have spaces that are welcoming for different communities in the metaverse. And this is a question that we keep seeing in our conferences and our exhibitions. We are not an activistic festival, but we stand out through who we are and what we propose. And Stella's presentation, the idea is really to work on moderation. I'm going to talk about this a little bit because I don't know if she's going to talk about the concept, but it's the principle of controlling or not exchanges within virtual communities. This is an idea that's been around for a long time, because since the beginning of computers, we started exchanging text messages on the forum, and you had forum moderators who used to say, yeah, okay, you can say whatever you like, or no, there are certain subjects that we do not accept, or we can talk about practically nothing. So there were different levels of moderation that at the time were reserved to forums, or what we called belting blocks at the beginning of the internet. It's not necessarily a core subject for many of us. It was reserved to a lot of people who were spending a lot of time on forums. And 20 years ago, that was a minority. And as time passed and the technologies were more widely spread, the fact that we're constantly on social media platforms, this question has become central. The platforms today use either algorithms to filter the words that are authorized or not. Certain countries block entire platforms because they don't want certain subjects to be talked about. And there are also companies and, above all, people who are pledged to assess each post, each potentially problematic content, and that's why each of you have had their Instagrams banned, either permanently or temporarily. And when things go that far, we are depossessed of our identity. They're very strong movements and very, very strong intrusions in our life. So the examples I mentioned are examples that I think are quite close to you. For those gamers among you, it's something that you've also experienced when you're in Fortnite or when you're in Minecraft or Neuroblocks. You know that there are rules of good conduct, and if certain of your actions are disputable, you can also be temporarily or permanently banished from these spaces. And this is what we are currently seeing. These practices that were in the forums and then on the platforms and now in 3D spaces are directly brought into play in metaverse. And they're a subject which we believe in the festival is essential to talk about immediately rather than after a crisis or after an event, because we can also say that it's no more, no less than a form of censorship or a form of power over user communities. I've worked a lot in Asia. I experienced very closely what China is doing with the firewall, the Great Firewall of China, and the possibility or not of using certain words or talk about certain themes in video games and in Chinese metaverses. And I can say that this is something that's very strong, because all of a sudden you can be dispossessed of your voice, sometimes of your identity. And in countries where we invest so much in your digital existence, it is a form of imprisonment. It's sort of a deprivation of liberty. It is extremely harsh. Well, that is an extreme example, but we can at least underline the importance of this and then predict or not. Of course, I can't see into the future, but to know whether these are practices that we will soon see here, whether we accept these or not. And Stella's work, among others, for me is exemplary because they're preparing us for this. They're giving us a way of understanding things, and is warning us, saying, careful, this is important, we have to look after this. So I'm sure that Stella will say a lot more about this, but this was why we invited you here to give us your presentation. Thank you very much for this introduction. I didn't listen to everything, so I might even reiterate what you said. So hi everybody, I'm Stella Jacob. I'm an artist and game designer, and I work on narrative video games and immersive experiences. Before, I worked for 5 years in a company that worked in the virtual reality and distribution and dissemination, so the war. And then I went back to school to study game design, and I did a professional thesis on the question of moderation in the metaverse. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, and along with the reflections that followed on from this. So I've always been fascinated by the power of new medias, by online videos, serendipity, non-linearity. And when I was young, I was lucky enough to have a father who worked for Apple for 30 years. So very quickly I had access to a computer. And in my modes of socialization, when I was 10 or 11 years old, I used to go on Abu Hotel, and I was part of a mafia. I had a blog on Skyblog. And I even, went into Second Life at the age of 12 years. I didn't understand everything, but it was fascinating. Since then, I've felt not necessarily the most connected online person, but I've always had this fascination for these online worlds. The beauty of the communities that it creates, and the sense of collective that can come out of this. We can see this, for example, with Craft, where we have guilds. And if you're familiar with it, it's far more than just a fighting team. In online worlds, we find this also often in solo video games with more animalistic interactions. That's the case in games such as Dark Souls or Death Stranding. An example that I really like is that of Journey. Journey is a videolytic experience that you experience alone. But at one point, another player can connect and come into our world. They appear, they can move around, they can communicate in a very minimalistic way with us. And during this small period of time, they will guide us and maybe help us in the middle of this desert of solitude. Well, I don't have any more slides afterwards, so... Sorry for that. So the example in my practice that we find with regard to Journey is Ping, which is a game that was created during a game jam. I wasn't alone, we made it in 3 days, and the idea was to propose a solitary Pong where you only have access to one part of the screen. You don't see the other part, there's no other part, there's no AI, no other player, and so we're playing alone. And it's actually a bit sad. So that's more of a conceptual piece of work. And facing the online world, we have another medium, which is that of virtual reality. So I worked for 5 years in this realm, and so therefore it's a media that I'm very interested in. We often called it the empathy machine, but it does propose a new vision. It has the capacity of putting us in the place of, and therefore for me, virtual reality is a care medium. But it's also a medium that allows us to see the invisible, and that's why it's also a medium for curiosity that proposes a more active approach for the users. I've put 2 examples. The first is one from 2012 called The Machine to Be Another, which is an installation where you can discover the body of another person through your own perception, their own perception. And the other example is Knots on Linus, which is from 2016, virtual reality, which presents in a visual format the way in which we perceive space from the point of view of a person who is blind and who bears testimony through audio tracks. And at the crossroads of these online worlds and virtual reality, we find the metaverse. Metaverse is a sort of an online world with maybe an immersive break. We don't really know. It's rather nebulous. but it's not a term that is technically applicable today. But the end purpose has already been written by science fiction, Ready Player One and No Crash. What Matthew was saying, anyone, is it's like technological conversions of virtual reality, multiplayer game, social media also, and it's this persistent, interoperable 3D play game that makes the world, which makes the metaverse. What we forgot is the other part of the definition of metaverse, which is one that we find in what I called proto-metaverses, VR chats or Euroblox or Fortnite. Fortnite, with this concert by Travis Scott, I'll put it in full screen here. So this live concert by Travis Scott, and we realize that it's also a convergence of practices. Online spaces are not just game spaces, they're social spaces for consumption, entertainment, and life. And I see these spaces almost as a possibility of a new public place without borders. And I'm very excited about it. So this is where the concept, the fiction of a desirable metaverse intervenes, that of a more open ecosystem, like at the beginning of internet, in a open source kind of thinking, more inclusive in terms of the audience, in particular because virtual reality is more intuitive than video games. That requires a little bit more sensorial motor capacities, but also more intuitive in terms of the approach to the metaverse, which is that of user-generated content, which allows a more developed customization of your environment and of yourself, which can potentially give rise to a better representation of each individual. Therefore, there's a horizontality in the relationships, and which can allow collaboration without materiality across the world and by manipulating concepts that don't even yet exist. It's possible and maybe desirable, therefore, that there's a spiritual side of the metaverse, and we know that that's very distant from climatic reality that is impacted by the existence of this metaverse. Because there's another subject, I don't think I'm the only one to share this with you, but another subject that is important to me today, that's sort of a social justice. Maybe it's a generational thing, I don't know, but today it's important to underline problems of sexism, racism, LGBTQ phobia. These are questions that are important to us, and through intuition and through my professional thesis, this is the question that I approached in terms of the subject metaverse. And this fear is crystallized around a subject which is that of virtual aggression. So maybe you've heard of this already or maybe not. But in 2022, 1 month after the announcement of the change in name of Facebook to Meta, certain countries already had access to Meta's metaverse. And there were the first stories of aggression on these platforms. The first one was related by a person called Nina Patel, who described that as in the first minutes in this virtual world, she was surrounded by 4 people who sexually touched her avatar. And another story about aggression that happened later by the subject, which was a research from a team called Some of Us, who was there to study interactions and found herself in a room with 2 avatars. One was pretending to film her and the other was pretending to aggress her, and they were passing each other a virtual bottle of alcohol. So there's a first, in 2016, a virtual story on QVR, where Jordan Bellemere talks about a virtual aggression of the same type by a player called Big Bro 442. And this testimony was relayed in the press at the time. So this question of virtual aggression is prior to the metaverse. There were already stories of aggressions in textual game roles online in forums in the 90s. But today, maybe it's a little bit more sensitive with virtual reality. Having said that, the way in which we can manage these situations and manage is very serious because it's not taken on board. So, talking with people in the road and conferences, the first answer was that it was just a game. And all I had to do was to switch off my mouse, switch off my computer, and even maybe I should hide my identifier, therefore I wouldn't be in danger. But we're talking about people taking photos against your will, about virtual sexual contact, and then there's something called the ghost touch, which is the fact of feeling somebody's touch through yourself, just as if you being a ghost is passing through you. The Polytechnic School of Lausanne did some research on this subject and concluded that embodiment, the fact of having an avatar, directly impacted episodic memory, that of our life experiences. And the effects on our brains were the same as going to McDonald's in virtual reality. So therefore, we cannot reproach the victim of having the same information in the brain. It's not, we can't even say on the one side it's very immersive and it's amazing because it's immersive, and then say, well, no, it's not that immersive. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And these virtual aggressions, from me, go along the lines of what we call online toxicity, which is present on our web too, on the social networks, etc. And online toxicity is a phenomenon which, via the virtual world, will disinhibit our behavior and sometimes participate in the polarization of thoughts. And we can see that this has had a political impact today with the development of light rights and Trump's election. There's a sort of a big mess there that nobody really wants to explore, but it is a societal question. So today in the multiplayer video games, we consider that more than 57% of players have been aggressed online. And that comes from Ditch the Label, which is a British research institute. So, in the face of this, what have we done? What exists? Well, it's not a law. There's not really a police, but we have moderation tools. So these tools were listed by a researcher called Liazaman Farazan. And so there are some represented here. There are others that exist. I didn't have the room to put them all up. But we have, for example, the vote to ban one of the users. We have the fact of contacting the game support or a user's report. So this consists in calling upon an authority without knowing or controlling what happens afterwards. We have the kick out or the ban of the player. That means removing the player from the space or preventing them from coming back in forever. So that's when discussion is no longer possible. We have the concept of safe zone, which allows a victim to become isolated in a space in order to settle down and gain awareness. We have mute. Sometimes we mute ourselves, sometimes we mute the other, and that is a way of erasing the other's existence, but they continue to exist. And there's the final example, which is often used for virtual reality, which is that of the space bubble, which prevents anybody from approaching under less than a meter to our avatar, because it is implemented in this virtual world. So these tools are useful. They're used for emergency situations, but we need to be aware of them. And they have to be implemented in all virtual worlds. But above all, we realize that among this list, there are almost one-third consist in distancing ourselves as a victim. Momentarily, maybe, but little by little, this participates in the phasing out of this person. We know today that online toxicity mainly targets people who are on the fringes. And I don't know for you, but for me, these tools resonate a bit like a plaster on a big wound. All of the onus is on the victim. There's no education. And the only actions you can do is a form of exclusion, and there is no work on rehabilitation. Sometimes at the very best, there's a small charter and recommendations for behavior. So great. In these virtual worlds, we've completely evacuated the concept of justice to the benefit of moderation tools. So, by bringing together these moderation tools and connecting them with the different functions of justice, these different functions of justice have been listed by a sociologist called Gwenry Cordo. And we realize quite visually here that there are at least two missions of the justice that are not even fulfilled by these moderation tools. The first is rehabilitation, which allows the person convicted to become a better person, and the one that and compensation, which means that they can repair the prejudice suffered by the victim. So that's reparation. And so what I underlined in my professional thesis is that moderation tools are really a vision of technological solution and not a political reflection, because we put to one side everything that could allow us to improve things, according to me. And all of this for what effectiveness? I was talking earlier on about the questions of online toxicity. The subject has not been evacuated. We've not solved this question for Web 2, so it would be good to solve it for Web 3 or the metaverse. And therefore, in this graphic of the Anti-Defamation League, which is an American institution, we see right at the bottom that 19% of players admit that they've already sexually harassed somebody online. And we're talking about one person out of every 5. And that's where we wonder whether 1/5 of the population really does this, or is there not a way of dealing with them differently rather than just excluding them from these spaces? Because those people, maybe they need education, maybe they need discussion, and to change thanks to restorative justice. So restorative justice is an approach to justice which is parallel and which was developed in marginal circles. So first one in Native American communities in Canada, and then more recently within the framework of intra-community violence between LGBTQT+. So it's a process which allows us to reposition the victim in the center with the person accused and the community. This notion of community that's very important here, because we can even take things further and say that conflict management is what allows us to really be a community and to focus on the question of how. And that's what we've lost in the online world. It's this notion of commons, and I think we've been talking about it constantly over these past few days. And this approach might allow victims to be cured and to help the... so there's this question of restorative justice that we need to use, but it requires the development of tools and of tests. And so when I wrote my professional thesis, I thought of proposals for design inspired from restorative justice, and I realized that I find myself simplifying all of the systems that exist. And therefore, I kind of, backtrack and I do things, but I'm not very convinced. And this is linked to the fact that game design, just like any artistic approach, we give a vision of reality. And therefore it's simplified, sometimes for the better to underline a message, sometimes we don't realize. And we propose very well-colonizing visions, sometimes with reconfigurations of the body that are extremely sexist, quite simply. And all of this necessarily relates a subjective vision of the real. So, and here we touch upon a real subject. We never talk about it, or very little. Or it hurts, or people don't like talking about it. We have to talk about the subject of politics of the virtual world. So it's not a bad word, and it might be important, because when we bring back the subject of politics, at least there's debate and discussion. So when we design interactions and games and social media, sometimes we step out of the game, which is a protected bubble of the world, but actually we're conditioning our exchanges. Maybe we become gaffer fashionists of the world, sorry for the play on words. But the use of digital world will condition our exchanges. A wink or a hi and bravos, congratulations become likes. And we design economic structures and we forget exchange, and therefore we prevent a whole vision of the world. And these alternatives are important and necessary. They must continue to exist. So these are great designs, they're simplifications of the real, sometimes voluntary, sometimes we don't intend to do it. But they are alternative visions which are not shared, and they're evacuated to the benefit of simplification. And today, the metaverse designers are currently conditioning our future interactions. And therefore, their work has heavy consequences. The question I raise, what is the notion of urbanisms, and what are their notions of politics, and what are their notions of justice? In particular, all of the metaverses that stem from firms such as Meta. So that we are struck by the Silicon Valley way of thinking, and we forget that this is politically branded. It is an approach that of technological libertarianism that derives from transhumanist thinking. And there's this idea that technology can save us, but libertarianism is also the idea that liberty is at the very heart. So what is funny with the GAFAs is that freedom is at the center, liberty is at the center, but we prefer freedom of markets and freedom of individuals, because when there's a financial risk, then we remove a bit of freedom to from our individuals. And for example, Wordsworth, who is number 2 of Meta, sent an internal message to which was leaked to the press in November 2021, and he underlined the commercial risk of a bad management of moderation and asks his users, therefore, to create a Disney-level moderation, which doesn't mean anything, but which involves very strong moderation with little butterflies and nice people everywhere. So that's how we find ourselves in a meta-horizon virtual world without a bottom part of the body, and that we're also observed constantly by Meta in these worlds, because their moderation system consists in being able to report a user, which automatically sends a video of our point of view over the past 5 minutes. So you are all observed. So it's necessary to remember that by creating in these spaces, myself, you, them, we're doing it according to the political vision of the structure that is established the framework, so potentially a GAFA. And therefore, our lives transformed into the digital world are subject to design. And that's where the concept of the virtual politics intervenes, which is a subject that is at the crossroads of design, technological knowledge, but also law and justice, therefore politics. Europe is already raising questions about this. Politicians have already noted the place that GAFA is taking in our lives, and sometimes they place themselves above the states and state laws. And moreover, Europe has recently voted a regulation that was in July 2022 called, 2 regulations actually, which is called the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, which will allow us to regulate and attenuate the political and economic risks related to the metaverse. The first regards the questions of monopoly to avoid situations of monopoly, and the second fixes the responsibility of the platform according to their state of monopole. So typically in a future where Meta becomes the metaverse, they will be in a situation of monopoly and therefore has more responsibility. If there's a cohabitation of a number of virtual worlds, the responsibility will be reduced. But it does not correct everything. And there is political life to be led within the metaverse, and that's the problem. Because maybe the most enlightened people on these subjects will not look at the question of the metaverse, because the metaverse concept is maybe an ecological aberration and is carried by the digital giants. Politically, it's very complicated to work on these subjects. And that is the paradox that I find myself in today. Should I let these worlds develop and maybe even virtually leave it? So for Meta Horizon, for the time being, is a world in which Meta has the executive, judicial, legislative power. It's a digital dictatorship, actually. And do I just let them get on with it? I don't participate in the emergence of the concept of metaverse, or do I participate in the design of this metaverse? And do I push towards this idea of a desirable metaverse with the risk, the ethical risk of myself excluding alternatives that I do not have in mind, or that I do not wish to promote? So today I don't have the answer. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to try to continue to raise awareness about the subject around me via conferences, and in my artistic practice I try to develop related projects. I have this project called Common, and it's important. It's funny because it reminds me of what Marie said this morning. Common is an experience that is potentially on a platform such as metaverse, such as VR chat, and I was lucky enough to do a small residency here in Arles this summer with Fisheye Immersive, and this experience calls upon the question of upstream education with tutorials in which we are led towards empathy. That is complicated because we're talking to different profiles, and I have in mind young trolls, 12, 13-year-old kids who are going to experiment on the internet without thinking about others. And this is the angle that I've decided to approach. So I've proposed a really great experience that leads people to be towards empathy, which is not easy. So there we go. That's a project that is underway. It's still being written, still being developed. So if you want, you can look at the progress of this project on my networks. I hope that I was clear enough in what I wanted to say. And thank you for your attention. Thank you, Stella. And well done for your work. Very impressive. We can see your background, your way you develop your thinking, your practices. Does anybody have a question for Stella? I do have some personally, but... So, hi. Well, I wanted to thank you for your presentation, which was superb. I would like to take the floor. I was very touched by everything that you said. Thank you very much. As a survivor of a sexual aggression, and online sexual aggression, and I would even say online rape, I would like to bear testimony. These happened in spaces that were games, MMORPG, where I was the victim of certain violences that affected me greatly, and today mean that I have trauma which make it impossible for me to return into these environments. And when it happened to me, I had nobody to talk to. And you're the first person that I see talking about this currently in a serious manner. And I'm thinking, well, how long did we have to wait to hear this type of presentation? Because you are telling us, you're talking about the 80s and the online role game forums. It's been there for a long time. How long have we waited before this question arose about, well, what justice do we want for this? And what do we do with the victims? What do we do with the people who have led this aggression? And at the time when it happened to me, I tried to find a way of dealing with it, but I was faced with a wall. Nobody was ready to even hear what I had to say. So I just left. I self-excluded myself from the place, and I never came back. I disappeared from all of the online games. So thank you for your intervention. And that's it. I just wanted to share this with you. Thank you for your testimony. Any other comments, questions for Stella? So once again, we have a conference afterwards, but Stella, you're with us for this afternoon. And at the break, we will be able to chat together. Thank you very much, Stella. Oh, sorry, Mathieu. No, I just yesterday we were talking about this. What is interesting in what you were saying is it worthwhile doing it in the metaverse or not? And we were talking about it yesterday because it's interesting. Maybe one possible direction is that the metaverse has the right place to experiment new politics. So, in our world, that we constantly want to allow our society to evolve, in particular because it's changed a lot since we created our current systems, and we have the opportunity of testing them, and play testing politics, and play testing security, which could then pass into real life. So I found that very interesting from our discussions yesterday. And maybe it's a very good reason to do it in the metaverse, not necessarily just for the metaverse, but also for real life. Yes, I presented this idea of the metaverse as a laboratory of real life that I really like. But there's a thing where when we're faced with all of these subjects that are very weighty and complex, we realize that maybe we need to move directly onto action into real life politically. And this is also why I am equipped for all of this. Yes, I just wanted to come back this morning. Marie was talking about the relative reliability of algorithms. And a recent study was published on Arte about Facebook, or Instagram, actually, where there is a form of hypocrisy because, in theory, we are not allowed to show any nudity or things like this, whereas the algorithms, it's been demonstrated that they promote images of partial nudity. So there's a real paradox there, and I think at that level there is a discussion to be had to know how these algorithms work, because this all leads to a sort of a verbal violence. Yes, this is the constant problem of algorithms that are designed to attract our attention. And to what extent attracting our attention is a good thing for mankind. Yes, but it is directed from a sexist point of view. Quickly, because I couldn't broach this topic in my present, I tried to at one time identify the different stakeholders that could represent a form of justice in the metaverse and what already existed for moderation. Therefore, we have three main players. I'm just going to give you the information. We have three players. We have the AIs, which today used for moderation. And as you were saying, they are completely biased, therefore we cannot rely on them, but that is used extensively. Then there can be moderation from humans behind it, so that's one solution, super. There's a second approach, which is that of a moderation managed by teams that belong to the company who bring this world alive, and there we are clearly in a virtual dictatorship, I repeat. And sometimes they have to apply legislation which is not their own, but that means that they are depositaries of a state authority or Europe or whatever. And the last way of bringing justice and moderation is something that's already used today. That is a community moderation, which is linked thematically with the question of restorative justice. And typically the example of Discord and the functioning on service where there is self-moderation. I think that these are examples that we must study in the management of communities, crisis and conflict. There you go. Thank you, Stella. Thank you very much for all of these enlightening possibilities.